afternoon, and assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and to really see a lot of conversations and connections happening. For me, as someone working and studying in the field of conflict resolution, it can sometimes feel a little lonely and a little hopeless, feeling in isolation and not always hearing about sort of more the negative pieces of religious encounters as opposed to the positive ones we've been seeing here today. So thank you all for providing me with a reminder of why this is important and why it's needed. So the point that I would like to make is one that's actually been made several times throughout today and also throughout yesterday as well, which is this idea that religious diversity can serve as a means for unification as opposed to one for division. And this is something that we've talked about in the last few days, and it's something that I'd like to supplement and add to the conversation by adding my own personal experiences, many of which come through my experience as a Muslim student at a Catholic undergraduate school. Actually, my journey into the work of interfaith dialogue and interfaith conflict resolution began with an invitation. It was an invitation from the Catholic chaplain at my undergraduate school who invited me to attend Catholic Mass when I had approached him, saying that I was interested in not just learning about Catholicism and other religion, but also sharing my own faith. And so when he invited me, I felt almost like a positive kind of obligation to attend. And that decision to attend is one of the best decisions I ever made, because in that first experience of encountering another religion, I was struck not only by how much we had in common, how much the scriptures and his homily had in common with things that would be said in a mosque and I imagine in a synagogue and other houses of worship. But I was also struck by the differences in the way that worship is conducted in the Roman Catholic tradition actually, in a sense, strengthened my own faith, because it compelled me to, as I was learning more about Catholicism, I kind of had this experience of a new curiosity, and that kind of curiosity I brought into my own faith tradition. And I pursued my own faith tradition with a curiosity and excitement that I hadn't had quite before. And so in many ways, my encounter with Catholicism and learning about Catholicism, I was able to take that and apply it to my own religion, and as a result, have become a better Muslim. There were a lot of experiences I was involved with as a student. I was involved with campus ministry. I ended up being a theology minor. I developed a lot of relationships with Catholic priests, many of whom continue to be sources of spiritual support for me as well. And so all of these experiences really reinforce this idea that religious diversity can be a force not only for personal transformation, but also collective transformation, if that's something we choose to pursue. And I do want to emphasize that it is a choice. We have the choice to pursue religious diversity with hostility or with judgment or with, ideas of conversion. That's also a choice. But the choice that I pursued, I found has been incredibly beneficial for me personally, and also for those Catholics who I've been able to develop very close relationships with. And so I want to go into some of what Roman Catholicism and Islam both have to say about this kind of engagement with religious diversity. I want to start with a verse that was introduced to me by a Catholic priest that kind of talks about this idea. It's John 10:16, and the verse reads, "And other sheep I have, which are not of this flock. Them too I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd." And so it reinforces this idea that when we have a shared God, a shared shepherd, and even though we have distinct groups in terms of race, religion, ethnicity, that even amid all of that, and those differences are important, there's still this notion that we belong to one source, we belong to one creator, and so that can be a force for connecting as opposed to dividing, again, if we choose to pursue that path. I also want to quote a document that came out of the Second Vatican Council called Nostra Aetate. It's the Declaration on the Relation of the Church with Non-Christian Religions. I'd just like to read a portion of it here. "The Church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God, living and subsidizing in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth. Though they do not acknowledge Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. They also honor Mary, his virgin mother. At times they even call on her with devotion. In addition, they await the day of judgment when God will render their deserts to all those who have been raised up from the dead. Finally, they value the moral life and worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. There are a couple of reasons why I chose out this particular source of scripture, and it's because it recognizes both the similarities and the differences. And I think there is sometimes a tendency in interfaith dialogue to want to not delve into what the differences are out of fear of kind of causing discomfort or challenging other people in ways that might be uncomfortable or give rise to some tension. But I think this document does it very well in the sense that it very simply states what the differences are, but it doesn't really view that as, well, we can't get along or we can't communicate. Rather, it's suggesting to me, the way I view it, that we can have these relations that are positive and enriching, and that this doesn't have to involve converting or changing what we believe and hold closely. There's Mona Siddiqui is a British Muslim academic, and she kind of speaks to this idea that we can really cherish these differences. In one of her books, she writes, "If the most profound message of the cross is about God's power of love and forgiveness reaching out to all of humanity, this is a message I cannot ignore." And so this is actually an experience that I had with Roman Catholicism, where delving into the religion, I found that there were many pieces of God that I discovered and learned about that hadn't quite been presented to me in the same way. And so, as she mentions here, the idea of God becoming mankind and sacrificing himself for the salvation of his creation, that to me is a beautiful manifestation of what I know God's love is to be. Even though in the Islamic tradition it's not quite presented in the same way, I think there can be truth found in something that on the surface may seem to be completely contradictory, but can actually reinforce parts of our own identity and our own beliefs. So I've cited a couple scriptural evidences from Christianity. I'd like to turn to Islam now. And this is actually a verse that's been cited multiple times, but I'd like to repeat it. It's chapter 5, verse 48 of the Quran. "If God had so willed, he could have made you a single people. But his plan is to test you in what he has given you. So strive as one human race in all virtues. The goal of all of you is to God. It is he who will show you the truth in what you dispute." And so it's this idea that not only is diversity there for us to embrace and engage with, but it's also this notion that it's not an accident, it's not a coincidence, that God makes no mistakes in his creation. And so that's something I think that needs to be paid attention to, that this diversity is here for a purpose. And part of what I see my duty as a Muslim is to engage with that and really wrestle with that, just as I do with other pieces of my Islamic faith and my Islamic identity. There's a passage, a quote from a book written by Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf, who some of you might know. He's an imam in New York and had been involved with the Ground Zero Mosque. I think he really speaks to this idea as well. And he says, "In the Quran, we read that there are Jews and Christians who are sincere and devout, who compete in acts of goodness and who will receive God's approval and salvation. So there are upright people of faith of whom God approves, whether they call themselves Christians or Jews or believers or Muslims. And there are hypocrites and evildoers in all those religious categories as well. The real divide is therefore not between Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Buddhists, but between godly believers and ungodly people, which includes religious hypocrites. We must work to make the godly/ungodly divide dominate over the current attempts to divide Muslims against non-Muslims." So what he's talking about here is something that I talked in depth about with one of the Catholic priests, Father Guido, who I came to know very well as a Muslim during my undergraduate years. And he and I often talked about this idea that exclusivists of any religious tradition often have more in common with each other than they do with those they claim to represent. And that's something that he and I explored a lot. And actually, I think our relationship demonstrates this idea that two people of different faith traditions are able to, in many ways, connect on a deeper level because they share a similar kind of approach and an openness, inclusivity, a pluralistic approach to other religions that people within our own tradition might not have. And I can say, having had the blessing to develop close relationships with many Catholics, many of them I feel much closer with and able to talk about my faith with, much more so than some Muslims who I was raised with, just because there's a very different approach to the faith. And I think, again, that's something that's worth paying attention to and worth committing to. And so this idea of pluralism is this idea that diversity is there not merely to be present, but to be actively engaged with. And an example I can think of where diversity is present but not engaged with occurred also when I was during my undergraduate years. I would often regularly attend Catholic Mass services. And I noticed at certain points during the sign of peace, when it was time to exchange the sign of peace during the service, there were certain Catholics who I noticed over time consistently would not return the sign of peace to me. They would not look my way. They would not take my hand if I reached it out to them. And so as this happened over time, I realized that that could not have been a coincidence. And so I think it reinforces this idea that just because a diversity is present, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be engaged with. And I think that experience demonstrates a lot of that. Pluralism is also, it's not ignoring differences, but embracing them. It's not relativism, but the encounter of commitments. And I think my relationship with Father Guido, the priest who I mentioned earlier, really demonstrates this quite well. Because we're both very rooted in our traditions, but it's through our traditions and through our approach to our faith traditions that we're really able to have a very strong relationship, and why he's been one of the greatest spiritual mentors I could have asked for, and really demonstrates to me so much of what Islam encompasses and practices in terms of demonstrating compassion and mercy and being present amid people who are in suffering. And so I want to share something. I had emailed him a little while ago with something I was struggling with personally. I want to quote part of his response. I recently read an exchange between a Muslim Sufi and his Catholic monk friend in Algeria in the mid-1980s. After a long period of separation, when they were not able to talk to one another, they were reunited, and the Muslim said to the Christian, "Should we draw from our common well again?" Meaning their in-depth conversations about prayer and God. The Christian joked, "And what do you think we will draw up from its depths, Christian water or Muslim water?" And the Muslim replied, "God's water." And then he wrote, "The well may be deep and dark, but not dry. Let our prayers for you, yours and mine, be the buckets we lower, and may we draw up the water that you need." And this is moving to me for a number of reasons. We're talking about one God. Our prayers and our faith, and they are rooted in distinct traditions, but at the same time, there is a universality in that. It's kind of almost like a contradiction where they are different, but at the same time, they're not. And I think his response here really encompasses that. And so I'd just like to close by talking about a story, a personal experience I had on the last day at my college campus. I had regularly developed this practice of performing my Islamic prayers in Catholic worship spaces. And so there was one of the chapels on our campus is for the Dominican, for our priests in particular, and they have morning prayer services which are open to everyone who wants to attend. And so on my last day as an undergraduate on my college campus, I decided to attend. And after the service had concluded, and everyone had filed out, I went to a side of the room to perform my own Islamic prayers, which is something, as I mentioned, I had become accustomed to doing. And as I was finishing and getting ready to leave, I noticed that one of the priests had actually lingered and stayed. And he made eye contact with me, and he didn't say anything for a moment. And then he said, "What you're doing here is very extreme. You shouldn't be here. Don't do this." And then he walked away. Moments before that, Father Guido had approached me while I was still sitting in the pews, and he had told me that that morning he had offered Mass for me in my name, knowing that I was anxious of leaving my undergraduate school and for what was coming ahead. And so I think there's a choice demonstrated in these two responses that I received from two priests who I trust take their faith very seriously. I can't speak to their intentions or their faith because that's something that only God can understand fully and speak to. But what I can speak to are the implications that their engagements had with me on the recipient. One left me hopeful and the other left me distressed. And so the message that I would want to impart here to each and every one of you is that how we each decide to engage with the religious other is our own individual choice, but that fate is shared by us all. Thank you very much.